I met a man named Arthur at a local heritage festival last year. He was dressed in traditional attire, every stitch meticulously researched, and he spoke about his ancestry with a reverent, glowing pride. He told me that preserving the purity of his culture was the highest calling a man could have. He seemed noble, even inspiring, until the conversation shifted to his family. His expression flattened instantly. He explained with a chillingly detached precision that he hadn't spoken to his youngest daughter in 5 years. The reason? She had moved to a city across a border that had been open and peaceful for decades. To Arthur, that line on the map was a sacred barrier, and by crossing it, his daughter hadn't just moved, she had become a malfunction. He described her not with sadness, but as a leak in the hull, a threat to the integrity of the collective we. What struck me most was his sense of satisfaction. He didn't seem to want peace or cultural growth, he wanted a front line. His identity only felt real when he was using it to exile someone. The moment the perceived threat to his boundary vanished, his purpose would vanish with it. He needed the enemy, even if that enemy was his own blood, to keep his internal engine running. This isn't just a personal tragedy, it is a structural demonstration. It is the algorithm of national mobilization in its purest form.
Nationalism is a social technology that treats the individual as a secondary component to the preservation of the nation's integrity. To understand how it operates, we must set aside the morality of the fire and study the expansion of the gases. This is a cold observation of the mechanism, how the boundary is drawn, why the threat is reproduced, and why this system never recognizes the word enough.
So, if nationalism is this algorithm,
Right.
an engine that Arthur uses to draw this incredibly rigid boundary,
Right.
how does that engine actually get built in the first place? Because, when you look at the mobilization systems of established nation states versus, say, post-colonial states, the mechanisms are just fundamentally different.
Yeah, they are. I mean, there is a sheer, almost desperate fragility inherent in newer borders.
Exactly. And to really grasp this, I want to talk about a young academic I met during a symposium in Geneva. We'll call him Eris.
Okay.
So Eris had traveled from a nation that had gained its independence only about 40 years prior. And he grew up in a culture where nationalism wasn't a choice,
Yeah.
It was a survival suit.
Right, it's everywhere.
Yeah, you could not escape it. Every single billboard in his city was this towering, neon-lit reminder of what they called the Great Struggle.
It's an omnipresent, really loud attempt to glue disparate groups together.
Precisely. It's an attempt to bind tribes that had been just shoved into a single territory by a colonial pencil.
Ow.
And while his European colleagues at this Geneva symposium, they spoke of nationalism as this abstract relic of the past, or maybe a dangerous modern trend. But Eris, he spoke of it as a brittle cage.
Yeah.
He described this specific psychological state. He called it the vulnerability of the new.
The vulnerability of the new.
It's this constant gnawing anxiety that if the state stopped shouting about its unique identity for even a single moment, the whole apparatus would just dissolve back into the ether.
Because there's nothing structurally holding it up underneath.
Right. And he recalled standing in this quiet, centuries-old library in London and feeling this profound, aching sense of envy.
Envy? Why envy?
Because the people walking outside that library, they didn't have to shout about being English. Their identity was baked into the very stones of the street.
Okay.
But for Eris, his national identity felt like a stitched-together costume. He said he had to keep repairing it with aggressive rhetoric, terrified that beneath the flags and the anthems, there was, nothing but a void left by the colonizers.
The anxiety Eris describes there, it's not just a personal neurosis. It's a direct reflection of historical reality.
Structurally speaking.
Structurally, yes. It is rooted entirely in the divergent mechanisms of state formation. The European states, like the ones with the identity baked into the stones that you mentioned, they formed endogenously.
Okay, let's pause right there on that term. Endogenously.
Sure.
You mean the formation happened from within, naturally over time, as opposed to being forced upon them?
Exactly. Endogenous formation is a process that spans several centuries. The sociologist Charles Tilly articulated this process with a really stark principle. He said, war made the state, and the state made war.
War made the state.
Right. If you observe European history from the Middle Ages through the modern era, you have centuries of warfare under continuously evolving technological conditions.
Better weapons, larger armies.
Yeah, and that constant threat forced these states to build centralized institutions. To survive against neighboring powers, a monarch or a ruling elite had to extract resources.
They needed money to fund the wars.
Exactly. They had to create police forces to maintain domestic order. They had to establish census offices to know who was actually available to fight, and build these vast standardized systems for tax collection to fund the armies.
So the state itself, right, the bureaucracy, the borders, the identity, it was all just a byproduct of sheer military necessity.
The external pressure of constant warfare forged the internal machinery. It was this prolonged, brutal process of institutional hardening.
And crucially, that hardening coincided with the advent of modernity, didn't it?
Exactly. As these states were centralizing for survival, they were also experiencing urbanization, industrialization, and the implementation of mass education.
Right, getting people off the farms and into factories and schools.
And that created a shared, homogenized high culture. People were being educated in a national vernacular, a single standardized language.
Because you need that to create a cohesive, mobile labor market for the industrial era. The people needed to be able to read the same instruction manuals in the factories. They needed to understand the same laws and serve in the same military regiments.
And because of all that organic integration, the modern state became a natural, established focal point. National unity could organically coalesce around it.
The borders were drawn in blood over hundreds of years.
Yes, but the institutions within those borders grew over those same centuries to match the populations. The identity became systemic.
But you know, that structural reality is entirely absent when we look at sub-Saharan Africa. The process there was not endogenous. It was exogenous, it was imposed from the outside, and it was startlingly abrupt.
Extremely abrupt.
The current political frontiers of these nations were defined almost entirely in European capitals, most notably during the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference.
Right, when they literally just carved up the map.
Exactly. And the drawing of those borders had absolutely nothing to do with the populations living there.
No, they weren't based on any existing cultural, linguistic, or societal unities.
They were drawn strictly based on European concerns for strategic positioning and resource extraction. The logic was completely external.
You give an example of that external logic.
Absolutely. For instance, the establishment of British East Africa. That was not designed to unite a specific group of people.
What was it for?
It was designed to safeguard shipping routes along the Nile.
Wow, just a logistical buffer.
Exactly. Or look at the Uganda Railway. It wasn't built to connect domestic communities for their own benefit. It was laid down to provide rapid access to the resource-rich interiors of the continent, pure extraction. And the state institutions that resulted from this process were inherently weak.
Because they weren't built to govern.
Right. They were structured heavily to serve the concerns of external settlers and distant empires, rather than to actually govern or protect the local populations.
In this exogenous imposition, it created an immediate and severe structural problem. Immense ethnic fractionalization within these newly drawn, completely arbitrary borders.
Yeah, the numbers on that are staggering.
The statistical data from these regions highlights a stark contrast to those organically formed European states we were talking about.
Right.
In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, you have over 200 distinct ethnic groups forced into a single political entity.
200?
Yeah. And in Chad, there are over 120 different languages and dialects spoken.
That level of fractionalization is just, it's staggering. Imagine trying to coordinate a single national project with 120 different linguistic starting points.
It's nearly impossible. And in Kenya, the largest single ethnic group, the Kikuyu, constitutes only 22% of the total population.
So no one has a clear majority.
Exactly. When you compare these figures to European ethnic fractionalization indices, the European numbers are remarkably low.
Because their homogenization process took place over centuries.
Right. But in the post-colonial world, when decolonization finally occurred, the independence leaders and local elites simply inherited these artificial boundaries.
They were just handed the keys to the machine.
A machine that was never designed to run as a unified nation.
European state formation operated like a geological process.
Okay.
It required immense pressure applied over millennia to slowly compress distinct, disparate materials into a solid, unified bedrock of identity.
Right, the stones of the London Library.
Exactly. Post-colonial nationalism, conversely, functions like attempting to build a house starting entirely with the roof.
The roof first.
Yeah. The political elites are trying to force a unified, overarching national identity down over a profoundly fractured and completely artificial foundation.
And because the foundation is fractured, the elites are forced to hold that roof up artificially.
They have to.
To hold these deeply divided states together, they initiated this rapid, desperate process of inventing traditions.
Because they didn't have organic ones to draw on.
Exactly. They attempted to synthesize a shared past for countries that literally did not exist 3 generations prior. We observe this directly in the historical record, specifically in the authenticity policies implemented during the post-colonial period.
Right, the authenticity policies. These were the policies designed to purge colonial influence and create this seemingly authentic indigenous national identity.
Yes, but the implementation was inherently contradictory.
So?
Well, look at Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo. He initiated a sweeping program of renaming things to approximate a historical antecedent that never truly existed in a unified sense. He changed the capital's name from Leopoldville to Kinshasa. Furthermore, the entire country of the Congo was renamed Zaire.
Which is an incredible detail, by the way, because the word Zaire was actually a Portuguese mispronunciation of a local word for the Congo River.
Exactly.
So in an attempt to completely cast off colonial legacy and establish a pure indigenous identity, the state officially adopted a colonial linguistic error.
It perfectly reveals the deep artificiality of the whole effort. And another stark example occurred in Chad under Francois Tombalbaye.
What did he do?
He imposed the Yondo initiation rites, making them compulsory for all civil servants across the entire nation.
Okay.
The problem was that the Yondo rites were a specific regional cultural practice belonging only to a subset of the Sera people in the South.
So instead of finding a unifying tradition, he just took the highly specific customs of one tribe and forced them onto the other 119 linguistic and ethnic groups in the country.
Yes. He weaponized a local tradition into a national mandate.
Wow.
By taking the traditions of specific tribes and forcibly nationalizing them, these leaders attempted to construct the necessary boundary, separating the internal us from the colonizing them.
But it doesn't work, does it?
No, because this identity completely lacked the geological bedrock of time and organic integration you mentioned, it remained fundamentally brittle.
It required constant, forceful enforcement by the state.
The state had to continuously shout its existence, just like Eris described with the billboards, because silence would reveal the fractures.
So if a state's identity is that brittle and the internal divisions are that severe, how does the ruling elite keep the roof from collapsing?
That's the core structural question.
The answer, structurally, is that they need an external threat to force internal cohesion. They need a boundary dispute.
Right.
Because territorial disputes are rarely about the physical land itself. They are about the internal control the dispute facilitates.
The territory serves as a mechanism.
Exactly. And to understand the physical reality of this mechanism, consider the story of Javi.
Okay, who is Javi?
Javi was a low-ranking coastal guard. He was stationed on a completely barren, salt-crusted limestone reef that sat in the ocean between his country and a neighboring state.
Just a rock in the middle of nowhere.
Literally just a rock. But both governments claimed this specific rock as sacred soil. If you listen to the official state broadcasts back in the capital, Javi was celebrated as a sentinel of the motherland.
The state narrative elevated his position to one of supreme existential importance.
Absolutely. He was portrayed as a heroic figure, a shield guarding the foundational material of the entire nation.
But I'm guessing the reality was different.
The physical reality of Javi's life was a stark, brutal contrast. Javi was a man suffering from chronic sun poisoning. His diet consisted almost entirely of canned meat and desalinated water that perpetually tasted like rust.
Awful.
He spent his days staring at a flat, empty horizon where nothing ever happened, and the rock he was guarding, it literally disappeared beneath the waves during high tide.
It's not even land.
No. The sacredness of the territory was this abstract narrative fed to him via a crackling radio, but his vulnerability was entirely physical.
Right.
It was in the way his boots rotted in the relentless maritime humidity. It was in the agonizing way he missed the smell of his wife's hair back home.
It's a perfect example of how the individual experience is completely sublimated to the structural requirement of the state.
And sitting on that salt-crusted rock, Javi came to a very cold realization. He realized that as long as this border dispute remained unresolved, the government back in the capital could use it.
Using how?
They could use the threat of the neighboring country seizing the reef to justify emergency taxes. They could use the necessity of national unity to suppress protests occurring in the city streets.
Because you can't protest when the nation is under threat.
Exactly. The reef was not a strategic military asset. It was a leash. Javi was the one holding the far end of it out in the ocean, but he was also the one tied to the rock. He was a human sacrifice to a political mechanism that needed the conflict far more than it ever needed the land.
Javi's situation perfectly exposes the mechanism of territorial sacralization.
How does that process work structurally?
Well, the ideological history of any nation begins with land. Land acts as the material condition of the nationalist boundary.
Okay.
The governing ideology dictates that a nation exists only insofar as it establishes its presence and sovereignty on a specific territory.
So without the land, the nation technically doesn't exist.
Right. Therefore, a completely worthless piece of limestone rock undergoes a profound functional transformation. It ceases to be an ordinary geographic feature and becomes a sacred symbol of the nation's very existence.
But let us look at the actual value of that rock. I mean, the physical land in Javi's situation is completely worthless.
Zero material value.
It possesses no extractable resources, it offers no strategic elevation, and it has absolutely zero habitability, as we saw with the high tide. Yet, its psychological utility to the ruling elite is infinite.
Because once this territory is sacralized in the minds of the population, rational compromise becomes an absolute impossibility.
You can't negotiate over the sacred.
Conceding even an inch of the reef is no longer viewed as a pragmatic diplomatic exchange. It is structurally equated to the partial death of the nation itself.
You know, unresolved territory operates as the absolute cheapest source of political energy available to a government.
I mean,
Consolidating a fractured society around constructive domestic tasks, like reforming an economy, building infrastructure, or improving healthcare.
it's difficult.
It requires massive amounts of time, resources, complex negotiations, and painful political compromises.
Right, it takes actual governance.
Exactly. But mobilization around a territorial threat, that requires almost no effort. It occurs instantly. It taps directly into the primal algorithm of the boundary.
And this brings us to the precise operational function of Javi's suffering. International relations theory categorizes this behavior as diversionary foreign policy, or more bluntly, gambling for resurrection.
Gambling for resurrection.
Yes. The unresolved dispute over the reef serves strictly as a mechanism for internal control. When political leaders face severe domestic turmoil, economic downturns, corruption scandals, or civil unrest, they initiate or perpetuate international friction to improve their internal standing.
They create a crisis abroad to solve a crisis at home.
This triggers what political scientists call the rally round the flag effect.
Right, we've all seen that happen.
By emphasizing a territorial threat, the state creates a new, highly visible outgroup. This deliberately directs public dissatisfaction away from the government's failures and toward the external enemy.
It's a sleight of hand.
Exactly. The artificial tension provides the perfect justification for the suppression of domestic dissent, framing any opposition as unpatriotic or treasonous in a time of crisis. It successfully distracts the population from the material issues that originally induced their anger.
And looking at the historical record, there are concrete parallels of this mechanism operating globally.
Oh, everywhere.
The Falklands War is a primary demonstration. We really have to look closely at the conditions in Argentina in 1982.
Right. What was happening domestically?
Well, the country was ruled by the National Reorganization Process, which was a military dictatorship. And at that time, Argentina was suffering from a severe chronic economic collapse.
So the people were suffering.
Inflation was catastrophic, and labor unions were beginning to stage massive protests. Furthermore, the regime was facing intense domestic and international scrutiny for its ongoing human rights violations during the Dirty War,
where thousands of political dissidents had been disappeared.
Exactly. So the internal pressure on the military government was reaching a critical threshold. The regime's survival was entirely in question.
So what does the regime do?
They initiate a conflict over the Falkland Islands, a remote archipelago in the South Atlantic controlled by the British.
A diversionary tactic.
By seizing the islands, which the state heavily sacralized as Las Malvinas, the Argentine leadership commanded immediate, overwhelming nationalist fervor.
The rally round the flag effect in action.
Right. The very same citizens who were protesting the government's economic failures days prior were suddenly filling the plazas, cheering for the military.
Wow.
The conflict served to divert public attention directly away from the economic collapse and the atrocities of the Dirty War. By invoking the sacred territory, the regime momentarily bypassed its catastrophic domestic failures.
A remarkably parallel pattern emerges when we analyze the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands dispute in the East China Sea.
That's the sovereignty dispute between China and Japan, right?
That's the sovereignty dispute between China and Japan. Yes. And this specific island chain exhibits distinct diversionary characteristics. For extended periods, the conflict remains entirely dormant. The rocks just sit empty in the ocean.
No one cares about that.
Exactly. However, this dormancy is punctuated by brief, intense spikes of diplomatic aggression and public mobilization. And research directly links these specific escalations to attempts by the state to divert attention from negative domestic events.
The timing is never coincidental.
Never. It is perfectly correlated with internal stress. Consider the unrestrained anti-Japanese fervor surrounding the 2010 boat collision incident and the subsequent escalations in 2012.
What was happening internally in 2012?
Well, these highly publicized, emotionally charged diplomatic spikes coincided precisely with severe domestic political scandals in China. Notably, this period aligned with the Wang Liyun incident and the massive corruption scandal implicating Politburo member Bo Xilai.
Ah, so major upper-level turbulence.
Yes, along with broader systemic unrest and power struggles within the ruling party prior to a major leadership transition.
So, right when the internal political structure is experiencing a dangerous vulnerability and the public is looking at corruption within the elite, the state media suddenly pivots all attention to an external territorial threat.
Exactly. Similar diversionary mechanisms operate continuously in the ongoing disputes in the South China Sea and in the enduring Kashmir conflict between India and Pakistan.
It's the same algorithm.
In all of these cases, the territory itself is secondary. The physical land is just the anchor. The primary asset is the utility of the threat. The dispute is maintained because the algorithm of national mobilization requires the friction to generate loyalty.
But, and this is a big question, what happens when a state doesn't have a physical rock to point to?
Right.
What happens when there is no immediate border skirmish, but the government still desperately needs that political energy to keep the population distracted?
If the threat doesn't exist naturally, it has to be manufactured.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to see how this machinery operates, we look at the life of Elias.
Yes.
Elias is a senior editor at a state-controlled news bureau in a capital city where the industrial smog often hides the statues of the nation's founding fathers.
So his role is not to report reality, but to construct the boundaries.
His specific job is curation and escalation. Elias spends his evenings, as he calls it, sharpening the adjectives in reports about minor, insignificant diplomatic events or border movements.
Sharpening the adjectives.
He knows, with the weary, cynical precision of a veteran bureaucrat, that if the threat of the Western puppet or the foreign aggressor isn't kept at a low, continuous boil, the public might start paying attention to their immediate surroundings.
They might look at the failures at home.
Right. They might start asking why the local municipal hospitals are chronically out of basic antibiotics, or why the infrastructure is crumbling.
The external narrative must overwrite the internal reality.
One Tuesday, Elias was sitting in his cubicle. The air in the office was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the faint ozone radiating from rows of flickering monitors.
Just normal day.
Right. His assignment for the day was to take a routine incident, a stray foreign fishing boat drifting too close to the maritime border, and transform it through language into a deliberate act of maritime aggression.
Just a matter of typing the right verbs.
It was a mundane task for him, but on this specific day, he felt a sharp, unglamorous shame.
Why? What happened?
His young daughter had called him at the office to ask a simple question. She wanted to know why her class couldn't go on a school trip to the neighboring country.
Wow.
The very country he was currently painting on his screen as a den of vipers and a mortal threat to their way of life.
The contradiction between his private knowledge and his public output became unavoidable.
He watched his cursor blink on the screen, this rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat, and he realized the totality of his situation. His entire career, his ability to feed his daughter, was built entirely on the necessity of generating fear.
He's trapped in the machine.
He wasn't a journalist seeking truth. He was a maintenance worker for a psychological wall. And he could feel that the bricks he was expected to lay were getting heavier every year.
You know, the work Elias performs demonstrates a theoretical framework known as aspirational constructivism.
Aspirational constructivism.
This framework argues that a state's behavior in the international arena is not merely a reaction to external stimuli. It is dictated by domestically formed identities and aspirations.
So they aren't just responding to real events.
Right. Political elites and opinion makers do not simply look out the window and react to objective external threats.
So you're saying the state decides what it wants to be first, its aspirations for power, its desired political purpose, its preferred international status, and then it builds an identity to justify those desires.
They actively construct the nation's identity to serve their domestic political needs. But to solidify this self-image, to make the boundary visible to the population, they must cast an other.
An enemy.
Yes. This other is deliberately constructed as a counter-concept. It is an alien entity that is framed as fundamentally opposing the aspirations and the very essence of the state.
So where does Elias fit in?
The media acts as the primary instrument for this construction. It utilizes strict processes of information inclusion and exclusion to curate specific, tailored narratives that reinforce the boundary.
We can observe this algorithm operating with objective clarity when we examine the divergent media framing of a single shared geopolitical event, the Ukraine-Russia conflict. An analysis of American and Russian print news media demonstrates how radically different, completely opposed narratives are manufactured regarding the exact same physical reality.
The events on the ground are identical, but the constructed realities are entirely separate.
Look at the American media ecosystem. Media outlets like the New York Times employ framing techniques that construct a clear, unambiguous narrative of invasion and war. The language used immediately establishes a dichotomy of heroes and villains. Ukraine is depicted firmly as a heroic underdog, a sovereign, democratic nation suffering unprovoked, brutal aggression.
While Russia is positioned absolutely as the villainous aggressor and the sole instigator of the violence.
Exact.
And in this frame, the West is inherently positioned as a benefactor of democracy and a necessary counterforce to authoritarian expansion.
The narrative aligns perfectly with Western aspirational identity.
Yes.
Conversely, Russian state-owned media, such as TASS, constructs an inverse reality using the exact same set of events.
How do they frame it?
The conflict is explicitly not framed as an invasion or a war. It is strictly designated as a special military operation.
Which is a very deliberate choice of words.
It's not just a euphemism, it is a structural necessity for their narrative. It amplifies a framing of benevolent intent and defensive necessity.
In this constructed frame, Russia is positioned simultaneously in two roles, as a victim and as a savior.
They're portrayed as a victim of relentless Western expansion and encirclement, and concurrently as a savior acting to protect Russian-speaking populations from Western aggression and what the state media categorizes as a fascist Ukrainian regime.
So the West becomes the other.
The West, particularly NATO nations, is cast as the ultimate villain. They are framed not as benefactors, but as shadowy puppeteers orchestrating vast campaigns of disinformation and proxy violence.
It's complete inversion.
By entirely assigning blame to the West and Ukraine and portraying Russia's actions as a purely reactive defense of traditional values and existential security, the state media effectively curates a narrative that justifies immense military action and economic hardship to its domestic audience.
And this framing requires us to analyze the specific mechanics of this evilization.
Evilization.
During Putin's third term, this construction of the enemy became explicit and deeply ideological. The Russian political elite began to actively promote statist and civilizationist ideologies. They presented Russia not just as a state with strategic interests, but as a conservative great power, actively defending traditional moral values against a decaying world order.
But here is what I struggle to understand about this evilization concept. If you tell your people that the other side is a rival or a competitor for resources, you maintain the capacity to negotiate.
Sure, you can sit down and talk.
You can trade concessions, draw new borders, sign treaties. But if you tell your population that the opponent is fundamentally, existentially evil, don't you destroy your own ability to engage in diplomacy?
Because evil is irredeemable.
Exactly. You cannot sit down at a table and compromise with an existential threat without compromising your own existence in the eyes of your people. Aren't these leaders just trapping themselves? Doesn't this rhetorical strategy intentionally lock the state into a perpetual state of conflict?
Yes, that permanent mobilization is precisely the intended function.
Wow. So they don't want a way out.
In this constructed narrative, the counter-concepts, the West, liberalism, globalization, and democracy, are cast as asymmetrical to Russian identity. They are not framed merely as different competing political systems.
They are an active threat.
They are framed as an existential evil that is actively causing moral decay, demographic crisis, and the deliberate destruction of traditional family values.
So the goal isn't to win a debate or secure a treaty. The goal is the mobilization itself.
This evilization performs essential structural functions for the state. First, it intensely motivates domestic action and sacrifice against the perceived threat.
Right.
Second, it draws an impenetrable division between the national self and the alien other, reinforcing Arthur's sacred boundary. And third, most critically, it entirely silences domestic dissent.
Because if the state is fighting pure evil, any internal disagreement isn't just a difference of political opinion, it is immediate complicity with the enemy.
Exactly.
It transforms domestic political opposition into outright treason.
Which brings this structural analysis to its inevitable final conclusion. Nationalism, as an algorithm, exists exclusively in a state of mobilization.
It never rests.
It is fundamentally not a system of maintenance, administrative efficiency, or peaceful coexistence. It is a system of defense. Because it absolutely requires mobilization to maintain the political cohesion of its subjects, it must constantly, continuously reproduce a threat.
The engine needs fuel. But what happens when the fuel runs out? What happens when the external threat is exhausted? What if the neighboring country collapses, or the border dispute is definitively solved, or the external enemy is successfully defeated?
The system does not simply declare victory, demobilize, and allow society to revert to complex, peaceful interactions.
Because demobilization is equivalent to disintegration.
Yes. Without the pressure of the boundary, the artificial unity fractures. Therefore, the algorithm adapts. The boundary shifts.
Where does it go?
It turns inward.
The boundary moves from the geographic map and the international stage directly into the fabric of the society itself. Identity ceases to be a living, evolving culture. It hardens into a rigid, verifiable norm.
And everyone has to prove they belong.
This triggers what can only be described as a race of loyalties. In a mobilized system, loyalty is subject to rapid, inevitable inflation.
Like economic inflation.
Exactly. The more the general population demonstrates loyalty to avoid suspicion from the state, the less that baseline loyalty is worth to the system's filtering mechanisms.
So mimicry becomes rampant. Citizens adopt increasingly radical postures simply for self-preservation.
They have to.
They loudly echo state rhetoric to ensure they are not placed outside the shrinking boundary.
And because the threshold for what constitutes an acceptable demonstration of loyalty is constantly escalating, that threshold is inevitably set by the most radical, extreme, and uncompromising participants in the society.
Moderation becomes dangerous.
Moderation becomes indistinguishable from apathy, and apathy becomes indistinguishable from treason.
The system transforms into a devouring engine. It begins to digest itself.
Fine.
The process of filtering ceases to be about defending a geographic border and becomes entirely a mechanism of internal selection. The neutral zone vanishes completely.
You can't just opt out.
No. Silence is no longer read as a lack of opinion or as a desire to be left alone. Silence is read by the system as hidden betrayal.
As citizens simply attempting to live their life, going to work, raising their children, tending their garden, without actively participating in the continuous loud mobilization becomes inherently suspicious.
They stand out by not participating.
That suspicion turns them into ballast weighing the state down. And in a system defined entirely by the necessity of a threat, ballast is quickly reclassified as a threat itself. The very mechanism created to protect the society begins to systematically target its own components.
Nationalism does not solve the complexity of society. It reduces it to a boundary and an enemy. A system built on perpetual threat ultimately finds its final enemy in the complex, different living human being.